Welcome to the fifth webinar, the fifth weekly webinar of the Global Platform series. And it's quite incredible to me that we've already had 4 of these and this is the 5th one. I assume you're all, can you put up the first slide, please, Lucas? Sorry. Bear with. Welcome to the 5th webinar, the 5th weekly webinar of the Oh, and Lucas, can you turn off the sound on your YouTube because we're getting a delayed echo? So here we are. So the Global Platform, and I won't talk about what the Global Platform is. I think most of you are already familiar with it, but if you're not, or if you're interested, or you haven't checked for some time, please do have a look at our website, which is full of information. Today's topic is on something we can all personally relate to on lots of different levels. Lockdowns, and clearly we're going to have a particular focus on lockdowns and older people and how that plays out in developing countries and low and middle income countries. Before we start properly, I'd just like to share some preliminary thoughts that may help to frame some of our discussion today. Next slide, please. There's increasing evidence that the epidemiology of this pandemic is not following the predictions that people were making just a few weeks ago. To date, and I emphasize to date, the onset of the pandemic in most low and middle income countries has been much slower and more limited than many people were predicting just a few weeks ago. And here we have some data that I've just taken for Argentina and the Philippines, because these are countries we'll be talking about later. And you can just see, you know, small numbers of confirmed cases, relatively small numbers of deaths. And in the case of Argentina, there's a very erratic data from day to day, but a gradual rise over time. And in the Philippines, it's been pretty level for the last month or so. And bearing in mind that particularly in the Philippines, the total population is enormous. These suggest very limited onset of the pandemic, even bearing in mind that we know that these will be underreported, and we may need to multiply the levels of deaths by a factor of several to capture the reality of the pandemic. It's still been pretty limited in most low and middle income countries, with some exceptions like Brazil and particularly some other countries in Latin America. Now, some people might argue that this shows just how effective lockdowns have been. And had it not been for lockdowns, the situation would have been much worse. Other people, and it almost seems to be a matter of choice, choose to take a different position. And they say this just shows that lockdowns have been an enormous overreaction. They're a blunt authoritarian tool. They're an example of inappropriate policy transfer from USA and Europe to very different parts of the world. And this is, you know, a part of a, you know, a wider context in international development. It's a knee-jerk reaction, which is extremely inappropriate, especially in poorer country settings. Next slide, please. So today, WHO published its estimates that about 2,000 people, they estimate, have died as a result of directly as a result of coronavirus to date, since the pandemic arrived in Africa, which again, compared to the numbers of deaths that would normally occur in Africa over a 2-month period, a statistic that I wanted to dig out but I didn't have time to, is a very small amount. So again, this emphasizes the question of, well, why are we, you know, why are these countries persisting with lockdowns? And also a concern that these lockdowns may be generating more harm than good, not just in the UK or the USA, but very specifically in poorer parts of the world. There's a great blog that we have on our site, which we were allowed to copy from somewhere else, by Julie and Sapienza, which isn't specific to older people, but focuses very well on potential issues with lockdowns in poor countries. And it was written a few weeks ago, but I think the points it makes are still very valid. So it talks about poor people, that could be older people or people of all ages, being caught between a rock and a hard place in terms of the pandemic and their needs for survival in a context of very little support from their governments and from the states. So the full blog is available on that link. Next slide, please. They also make this very important observation, which I think will frame a lot of our thinking today. Any intervention, for coronavirus or anything else is clearly going to have positive and negative effects. And so what is the balance between those? And of course, this is very difficult when we have very limited information, particularly in poorer countries and in a very fast changing situation. So how can we make informed choices about the balance of good and harm that comes out of these interventions? One issue there is whether lockdowns actually do have an effect on infection rates and therefore on the numbers of people, especially older people, who die of this condition. Some people have claimed that in Europe, had there been no lockdowns, maybe 1 million people, almost all of them old people, would have died of coronavirus by now. It's very hard to prove a counterfactual, but some people who are quite reputable academics make that kind of claim. Today, I think it could be argued with a lot of confidence that in low and middle income countries, the greatest harm to older people hasn't been directly by the pandemic, but by responses to the pandemic, lockdowns and other responses. Although, again, it's very hard to know how many of those people would have become infected or died had those lockdowns not been in place. So there are many, many issues here we have to keep in mind. We have to bear in mind that, of course, lockdowns come in many shapes and sizes in terms of levels of severity, whether they affect populations more generally or whether they specifically target certain groups in certain ways, including older people, but not just older people, and the rights and wrongs of all of that. And of course, they change over time, as we're very aware of in the UK at the moment. So they change over time, and of course their effects change over time as well. And many of the harms that can result from lockdowns, of course, accumulate over time. So it's very different being locked down for 3 days than for 3 months. So this is probably more than a framing discussion. It's just a very long list of questions, which I'm sure we'd all love to be able to have answers to. And I am delighted to introduce you to an old friend of mine who I am very confident is going to be able to give us clear and confident answers to every single one of these issues. I would like to hand over to Carl Pillemer from Cornell University. Next slide, please. We'll skip the housekeeping slide. So Carl is many, many things. Among other things, he's a professor of human development at Cornell. He's the director of the Bronfenbrenner Center for Translational Research. He's also a professor of gerontology and medicine. And he's published loads of very prestigious journal papers through his prestigious career. But I'd like to point out the fact that he's also published a best-selling book about older people. And that in itself is a very unusual achievement. And this book, I think, goes a long way towards challenging ageist stereotypes and giving value to the views and the voices of older people themselves and saying that we can all benefit from those. Carl believes in public engagement, much more than many other academics do. And as a part of that, he has very strong views about lockdowns, and he enjoys a good tweet. And here's a tweet he made, I think it was yesterday, talking about lockdowns in New York. This may not apply in the context of low and middle income countries, but I know one of the reasons why I wanted Carl to chair this session is I think he's got some very interesting ideas about this issue. So over to you, Carl. And I hope you're able to keep the speakers under control. I suspect they will be very badly behaved, but good luck.
I can imagine. Well, you've trained me to be used to almost anything, and really grateful to Peter, who we also were able to host here at Cornell for a visit, which was really wonderful. And I'm extremely pleased to be part of this. In kind of a reverse order, I'll respond to one thing that Peter said. In places like New York City, I think the virus itself and the impact of the pandemic there has actually had strikingly more in common with what might occur in urban areas in developing countries. Rather than being all of New York City, most of the infections and deaths came from parts of Queens and the Bronx and Brooklyn that are very heavily immigrant populations, people living in close quarters and living in multi-generational households. So there, even in New York City, I think there are some of the themes that you will see elsewhere. I'll just say one quick introduction, and then I'll introduce the speakers, and off we'll go. And I think it's great. I think, you know, I think you've had more speakers in the past, so we probably have a bit more time. Our experience in the US is maybe, you know, educational for other countries whose outbreaks have not been as strong, because there's been complete variation between the 50 states. You may or may not have noticed that I think it's fair to say there's something of a failure in national leadership here. So almost everything has been done at the state level, which vary from Sweden type non-lockdowns to extremely draconian and highly restrictive lockdowns in other states. So there's going to be an opportunity perhaps to see what works and what doesn't. One thing I think we're experiencing here, but also around the world, I think that some of the key issues are, that I'm sure we'll touch on, are the hazards of the lockdown, namely isolation and loneliness, increased mental and health issues. In Western countries in particular, or in developed countries, we're seeing a spike in deaths because people are not getting well health visits and are not being seen for medical conditions. There also has been a notable rise in domestic violence, and in places where it's measured, elder abuse. I think that we'll discuss today, in some states, these lockdowns have been not health-based, but age-based, which has an issue. But I would say, and I'm sure that we'll deal with it today, but what I feel that we're learning here and around the world is the inevitable failure of one-size-fits-all solutions. You know, that there's such variation in our country within states and within a state, in your countries, for example, in urban areas versus non-urban areas, that I think, and I hope we'll talk about, you know, a lockdown may be necessary somewhere for periods of time and not elsewhere. Right now, I think using lockdowns looks a bit like the expression in English, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so I think we'll probably deal with some of that nuance. I'd like to introduce our speakers, but I've made the awful rookie mistake of every MC, and that is I did not have time to check for pronunciation. So I'm going to murder a few names, and I trust all of you to correct me as soon as the first one isn't relatively easy for me, which is Bethany Brown from Human Rights Watch.
Got it. Well done.
And there we go. Bridget, I'm going to try sleep.
That's right. Yeah, that's good.
There we go. Now, and then Diego Bernardini, I'm good with, from Mar del Plata National University. And Joseph, I'm going to go with Batak. You'll correct us, I hope, when the time comes. And I think we're going to start, Bethany and Bridget are sort of co-presenting, is that correct? Or you're taking, yeah, so you have, you know, roughly a half hour, and I will warn you at the 28-minute mark. So you're on.
Great, thank you. So we'll just give it, oh, okay, here we go. So I'm Bethany Brown. I'm talking to you from New York City, and I am a researcher on older people's human rights at Human Rights Watch. Bridget, do you just want to introduce yourself quickly before we get started?
Sure, thank you. So I'm Bridget, I'm from HelpAge International, and I'm in London at the moment, and I focus on older people's rights.
So on the next slide, you'll see a little roadmap of what we'd like to talk about with you today. We'll start off by talking about what human rights in emergencies like this actually are, because there are some acceptable limitations and guidelines. And then we'd like to talk about what older age discrimination actually is. Then once we have that sort of foundation, we'll do a little exercise together to apply those concepts to older people's human rights in this context of COVID-19 and lockdowns. And then lastly, We're going to talk a little bit about some of the historical underpinnings for this current moment and what we can expect and hope for the future. So over to you, Bridget.
Thank you, Bethany, and thank you to everyone in the Corona Older team for inviting us onto this webinar. So I think, as we're all increasingly aware now, governments can introduce measures known as emergency powers to enable them to respond to public health emergencies. And under these emergency powers, they can curtail some of our rights. This may include measures to slow down or to contain infection, such as restrictions on our movement, or governments may ease regulatory or legal requirements, or they may give greater powers to the police. And since these measures may negatively impact on some of our rights, there are safeguards or checks and balances under international human rights law to ensure that they are based on scientific and medical evidence, that they're temporary, that they're regularly reviewed so that they're only used when they are strictly necessary. The measures should also be proportionate, and they shouldn't create overbearing restrictions on our rights. They also should not discriminate, and they should always be provided for and carried out in accordance with the law. So I think a key question for us here today is whether the measures being introduced in response to the pandemic under lockdown are discriminatory. And if they are, then they're not legitimate emergency health measures. Can I have the next slide, please? So to determine if any of these measures discriminate on the basis of age or not, we can ask two simple questions. The first is whether age is the basis on which a decision is being made, whether on or action taken, or indeed no action taken. And the second is whether this has a negative impact on a person's rights compared to someone of a different age.
Thanks, Bridget. So now let's apply these questions that Bridget has set out for us. About, is a decision made based on age, and does it have a negative impact on an older person's rights compared to others? To two rights, we'll look at the right to freedom of movement. So the rights to be allowed to move around, which is under serious, which is a serious concern when we're talking about lockdowns, and the right to health, which is obviously an issue for all people in this pandemic, but particularly for older people in the context of lockdowns. And I want to say, we know this, but we'll remind you that all human rights are, of course, interconnected, and these are just two examples of the myriad of human rights that are implicated when we're talking about lockdowns during the pandemic. So Bridget, I know you've done a lot of work looking at freedom of movement across the world, particularly in low and middle income countries, and that HelpAge has been talking with older people about their experiences under lockdown. So could you tell us a little bit about what you've learned with a focus on freedom of movement?
Yeah, sure, that's right. Can we have the next slide, please, as well? So as Peter mentioned at the beginning, age-based measures have been used to restrict people's movements in countries all around the world in the initial stages of lockdown, and more are being considered now as countries come out of lockdown and they ease restrictions. And these measures include making people over a certain age, could be 60, could be 65 or 70, stay at home. And this is sometimes referred to self-isolation or curfew, confinement, or even shielding. Other measures that have been introduced use an upper age limit to decide who can go back to work or not, who's allowed to go into shopping malls, who can go to restaurants, who's able to take part in religious activities, and also who can use public transport. So upper age criteria that will prevent older people from doing these things. So thinking about our two questions to determine whether these types of age-based restrictions are discriminatory or not. First question, are they based on age? Well, yes, clearly, these are based on an age criteria. The second question, do they have a negative impact on older people's rights? So to answer that, firstly, we would turn to what older people themselves say. And in the Philippines, for example, where the curfew is stricter on older people have told us that they're afraid about extending the time they have to stay at home because they can't buy the medicines to treat their health conditions, and they have no other access to source of income. In Ukraine, one older woman told us that she lived in constant fear and stress. And in Lebanon, an older woman that we spoke to with heart disease, who had recently had heart surgery, said that she was scared of getting ill and not being treated. Another way to look at the impact is that we know already that there's a wealth of knowledge and gerontological research on the impact that long periods of isolation have on the physical, mental, and cognitive well-being of older people. And thirdly, we need to think about the impact that singling out one section of the population has. And this can have a significant stigmatizing effect. When you separate generations, you may well exacerbate intergenerational tensions and ageist attitudes, and also prevent older people from playing their part in solidarity with younger generations in building back better. For example, they may wish to return to work, to volunteer, or to participate in the community. In the UK, we even had an example where a TV company was saying that they weren't going to include older actors in the filming of new episodes of a TV soap opera.
That is wild. And those are really infuriating examples, Bridget. I would add one particular case that we looked at in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and we were looking at it because it fit this example of an age-based discrimination. In Bosnia in March, they set out a law that no one over the age of 65 was allowed to leave their home unless it was for an emergency health matter. So if they were going to the emergency room. So they weren't allowed to go outside to get food the way that middle-aged people could. They weren't allowed to go outside to get medicine from the pharmacy. And we talked with one daughter who told us how her mother, who was under this lockdown, told us that she couldn't even go to take out the garbage. She said, if I could only take out the garbage. And I think Carl mentioned draconian lockdowns in his entry. And I think that this is a perfect example, because it's not just that they were forbidden from leaving their homes entirely. It was also that if they did, they were fined. They were fined more than 1 month's average pension for Bosnia or Herzegovina. And over 200 older people had actually been fined in the initial weeks of that particular lockdown. So we published a paper in the local newspaper that's in English online, and it explained how this is really problematic for older people, and how the law doesn't meet the standards for what should be in place in an emergency. And we asked about it with the authorities. We discussed it with them, and the day after we published, they revised the bans to allow older people to leave their homes 2 mornings a week. And a few weeks later, the Constitutional Court in Bosnia and Herzegovina examined the ban and found a violation of the right to liberty of movement. And they found that the ban was disproportionate, citing similar reasons to what Bridget had set out at the beginning of our talk, there was no balance between the measures ordered and the public interest. They didn't consider milder measures that wouldn't inflict so much harm. And there was no time frame for the imposed measures. And there was a lack of regular review about whether the measures were necessary in a democratic society. Older people were really harmed by this in a way that younger people weren't. So the impact was there. It was huge. And being able to have freedom of movement, you can see how it's tied to their ability to access food, their ability to go to the bank to get out money so that somebody else can buy them food or buy them medicine, while middle-aged people could.
And that's a great example, and also sort of the power of calling out these types of discriminatory measures. Moving on to healthcare, what have you found in terms of the right to health?
One issue that's come up a lot for us is triage, which involves evaluating people for treatment in a situation of scarce resources. So that could be like in this pandemic, or in a mass casualty event, or in a war or a disaster zone. And similar to that is also rationing, which refers to allocation of resources in a more general setting, where there's less of a sense of urgency. For example, like organ donation, or limited supplies of vaccines, or other types of medical needs. And in the context of COVID-19, governments and others are providing guidance on how to conduct medical triage and rationing with respect to ventilators in particular. It's a limited resource, and it's anticipated that a lot of people will need them. So there's an issue there with some of these policies explicitly discriminating against older people, or people based on age. And it has the obvious potential to have a grave effect. And Bridget, I know that you've also been looking at that closely. But one of the public health solutions to prevent the need for that triage has been these lockdown measures, and that's part of why we're bringing it in here in the context of the right to health, because they're very much connected. And the next thing I'd like to flag around the right to health and lockdowns is nursing facilities and assisted living facilities, which Peter talked about at the beginning. It's kind of counterintuitive to some people that live in countries where there are things called nursing homes, but there isn't necessarily a nurse in a nursing home in the US in any case. And certainly that's the case in low and middle income countries as well, where people are being cared for in care homes or informal or formal settings. And in some countries, there are reports that people who are being cared for in these care homes when they contract the disease are not being sent to hospitals for treatment. Now that obviously implicates lots of other rights around the right to make decisions, the right to life, the right to live independently in the community, in the sense that should they have been in a facility in the first place rather than receiving care at home. I think that most people, as a matter of course, would want to have care in their home rather than in a facility. So Bridget, I have a question for you. Do you, thinking about all of these rights and all these ways that we've just talked about how older people's rights and discrimination has been playing out in the context of COVID-19, do you think that the fact that older people's rights have been ignored for so long have put older people at greater risk in this pandemic?
It's a great question. I think we can definitely see this in terms of age discrimination. Yeah. And maybe we can have the next slide, please. And what we can see, or we've been seeing sort of as the pandemic kind of rolls out, is that older people themselves and their organizations are beginning to question some of these age-based policies. And we've seen some backtracking by governments in Germany, France, and Argentina, which I hope we're going to hear a bit more about later. But I think that this has taken it's taken quite a bit of time. And I think that this is due to the fact that age discrimination is just not taken as seriously in both law and practice as other forms of discrimination. A couple of years ago, I did a survey of some anti-discrimination legislation in Asian countries and in European countries. And in the 20 countries that I looked at in Asia Pacific, only 11 of them had, so just more than half, had no legislation prohibiting discrimination on the basis of age at all. There was nothing. And in the countries that did have, those Asian countries that did have some legislation, it was mainly focusing on employment. So prohibiting age discrimination in employment, but not in other areas of life. And even in the European countries that I looked at, where the legislation is more consistent, most countries allowed for some exceptions. So there were some cases where discrimination on the basis of age was still lawful. And so I'm convinced that if age discrimination were taken more seriously, if we had laws that prohibited age discrimination in every aspect of our lives, not just in employment, we wouldn't be seeing the same levels of ageism and of these types of discriminatory measures based on age that we're seeing now in response to this pandemic. So certainly, I think there is a historical kind of basis that we should be looking at. But looking ahead now, perhaps to the future, what do you think the main risks are that we're facing, Bethany?
The crystal ball question. Could we have the next slide, please? I see the risk that a lot of older people could potentially die, and it's going to be viewed as sad, but not taken for the political decision that it was about whether or not to protect them. And I also see the risk that the discriminatory attitudes and laws and policies will continue. Lockdowns and visitor bans for a month are one thing, but what happens when older people are continuing to try to survive for 6 months, for 9 months of a lockdown? And I think that especially when countries start to open up, if older people are sort of kept under lockdown, there's the potential that they're going to be exposed to the virus anyway, because they're living with other people. And Carl, your tweet about that, I think is an important thing to remember. Even when people are under lockdown, they might be under lockdown but living with their adult children or receiving services in their home. We know that intra-household transfer of the virus is the #1 way that it spreads. So that's not a very rosy part of the picture. Bridget, what are you concerned about? What do you see in the future risks?
In the most immediate future, one of my concerns is that as we move into the recovery phase, we will see a sort of a strong resurgence of ageism, with older people being blamed for the high social and economic costs of the lockdown. So I do fear that. And I also wonder whether the rights abuses that we're seeing at the moment and the discrimination will have an impact on some of the political barriers that those of us who have been campaigning for better protection of older people's rights have been faced with for a while. And by political barriers, I mean some of the sort of the wider issues, such as, we've had 10 years of austerity measures. There's been a strong backlash more generally against human rights. We've seen the rise in populism and the rejection of multilateral cooperation, in particular attempts to undermine the international human rights framework. And while these have nothing really per se to do with the strength or validity of our arguments for better protection of older people's rights. They are still significant barriers to this. So that worries me.
So what do we do? How can we build back better from that?
I think the one thing that I am certainly encouraged about is the activism that we're seeing of older people and their organizations, those who are speaking out against ageism and age discrimination, abuses of their rights. And in some cases, getting governments to change their policies. I think this is something that we should all be encouraged by. And I think it's this activism that will keep the political pressure on governments, both in terms of ensuring people's rights are included in responses now and in recovery measures, but also in getting the international human rights standards, the convention that we need to make sure that older people's rights are fully recognized.
I think that is a great note to end on. We need that international agreement that's enforceable, that we can take to the bank, so to speak. Human rights are an important core of the answer to older people's protection from abuse and violation of their rights now, and the key to how we can build back better with a rights-respecting world out of this. So we'll go to the last slide and just leave you with the thought that we shouldn't waste the crisis. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was saying, I've done 20,000 of these Zoom meetings and still can't remember to unmute. Thanks so much. That was a great presentation, perfectly within the time frame and extremely helpful. Peter, am I right? You want to hold questions until all presenters have completed, or Lucas? I think that's right, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the way we've done it in the past, and it works quite well because they often cross-cut the different talks.
Okay, great. Now, so I've been given a little discretion, and since our first panelist went a little under time, our other two panelists were told 5 minutes, but I'm going to use my discretion to expand that to 7-ish if you have a little more to say. So I think we're going to Diego next, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Carl. Hello, everyone. Greetings from Mexico City. I will talk about the Argentinian situation, but I am here now based in Mexico City. So I will share my presentation. Can you see?
Yes, we can see it. Thanks, Diego.
Okay, let me check. Okay, have you seen the presentation as a full screen?
No, but
we can see it, I would say, well enough.
Because
Yeah,
I saw for a few
full screen.
Yeah. It's let me check because it's a kind of thinking. I don't know if it's the computer, if the connection.
Lucas,
okay,
there we are.
Okay, here we are. Yes. Okay. The idea of this short presentation is to cover 5 points: the Argentinian demography situation, of course, and the elderly specifically, and the epidemiological scenario as well. Also, I would like to mention what's going on with older people nowadays in quarantine days. And after that, I will move to a couple of different efforts or initiatives in terms of public policy oriented to elders. At the end, I will talk briefly, very shortly, about the perspective of these issues. In terms of Argentinian demography situation, we have 45 million people. 60% of them are age 60 plus, with a middle age average of 31 years old approximately. That means that we have about 7 million people older than 60 years old. From that universe, 20% of these people live alone, 30% with their partners, couples, or friends of the same generation, and the other 50% live in a multi-generational home. Other interesting data about older Argentinian people, 40% of them perceive their health as bad or regular, 10% have depression, a very important issue in terms of this lockdown situation that we are living nowadays in Argentina. We are in our 50th day approximately of lockdown, and the other 10% of older people live with some difficulties to do activities of the basic life. In terms of the COVID-19 epidemiology situation, we are till yesterday 5,300 approximately cases with 200, almost 300 deaths. We are with Mexico, one of the two countries with a very low level of tests for 1,000 people in terms of this ratio to compare with other countries. And as I mentioned before, our quarantine time starts on March 20. In terms of the older people situation, in Argentina, an average of 1.3% of older people live in long-term care institutions, compared with Spain, for example, that the percentage is more than 4%, or US around 5%. 70% of these residents in Argentina are women. We have approximately 6,000 of long-term care institutions, and only in Buenos Aires City, we have 1,300 of these kind of institutions. We are very close in terms of the situation of Mar del Plata, because it's our main summer city, similar than our Florida State country in terms of retirement destination of older people. There are 180 legal institutions. So we are calculating nowadays that a similar number of institutions are in the process of legal registrations, or directly they are working in an illegal framework. Some quick data of this universe of long-term cares shows that 60% have a low comfort level, same percentage of smoke detector installed that doesn't exist in this institution. And in this moment in Argentina, we have several cases. The last one was yesterday night, with massive spreads of long-term cares in terms of infections, several deaths, and so on. In terms of public policy ongoing, we have two different episodes that put on the political and media agenda the situation of older people's rights. First one was on Friday, April the 3rd. We have a huge number of pensioners come out from their homes to the banks to get the pension monthly payment, with the result of 1 million people on the streets. The second one was on Friday 17, when the mayor of Buenos Aires set up a disposition, a norm, that people 70 or more must contact a city phone number in order to get authorization to go out of their homes. This situation raises up the worries and the criticism of media and, of course, the people, with a huge political toll to the authorities. In Buenos Aires, we must remember that 1 in 4 are 60 plus. So as a consequence, 2 days later, the authorities, the mayor of Buenos Aires City, set up a group of experts to do advice and counseling on that. I have the honor to be part of the group. We are working with a couple of protocols, one of them regarding the rights, the decision-making process in order to do not vulnerate the rights of the older people. The norm in that example was declared anti-constitutional days later. And now, for example, as part of this initiative, we are in a volunteering program, a phone-based program for older people oriented. This program receives about 120 and 140 calls a day. And a very interesting situation is the request from users, older people, of course, to speak with somebody of the same generation. This is a very interesting information because the Buenos Aires government, the staff, is mainly young people. And we are see the gap between the dialogue, the expectations, and of course, the validity of the information between both generations. So,
Diego, we are nearing the close of your time. Just a sort of 1 minute warning.
yes, I'm finishing, Carl. Thank you very much.
I hate to ask you to stop because it's wonderful stuff.
Okay, just this is the last slides. So to finish this presentation, I would like to mention that a few days ago, people start to break, and older people, of course, to break the quarantine to move the economic situation. We will deal in the short future with a catastrophic economic scenario that probably will have consequences on the social protection system. Also, from many sectors, there is a claim to regulate and reconfigure the long-term care facilities in terms of legal regulations mainly. And of course, all of them should not forget that winter is coming to the South Cone. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's fascinating stuff. I'm not muted, am I? And we really appreciate it. Thanks a million. And Joseph, you are now on. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
And you're unmuted and everything.
Can you hear me?
Oh, there you are.
Okay. Is my voice okay?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So good evening from Bulacan Province in the Philippines, and this is a brief presentation. Next slide, please, Lucas. 55 days of lockdown. I will do some briefing and some lockdown initial effects and observations, some lessons and the way forward. Next slide, please. I live in Lucas. Okay. In this village where I live, there are 754 persons who are all the older people or older adults. This is 19% of the population and slightly more female. I did a survey on 11%. The average basic education is only 9 years, and the majority are between the ages of 70 to 80 years old. You can see that 96% of older people here have a companion, and only 4% are living alone. And most of those who have companions, 64%, between 1 to 4 companions in the house. Next slide, please. Okay, initial effects. Okay, one is the hindered flow of fresh fruits and vegetables and other nutritious rich food. Higher food prices has also been encountered. So in this case, there is less food intake. At the same time, there's no household income because most of those who are in lockdown are actually daily wage workers, and these are where older people can be found. And there are no older adults who are allowed to leave their houses. So they're more sedentary now. My worry is that this will be leading to more frailty or contribute to muscle loss or sarcopenia if we do this in the next 6 months more. All cultural events have been canceled, which brought to a halt all the regular faith-related rituals. This is a very Catholic country. So April was Lent, and then here comes May for all the festivities. They're all canceled. And so it's very sad. There's an abundance of fake news and conspiracy stories, including something about the Clorox and disinfectants. Okay, so next slide, please. Some lessons so far. There's no pandemic preparedness or any guidance from both the public health officials and the security personnel. And so there's no consideration on how to take care of older adults. There's no testing, there's no tracing, there's no supportive isolation, as all of these services are given only at the public health center or the hospitals if you already have confirmed COVID cases. So older adults are requested to just quarantine themselves, put themselves inside the house, and that's it. That's the public health intervention. So given this, there's no information on what can be done to non-medical health advisories like sunshine, walking around, taking a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables, seafoods, some movements around the garden, sleep and rest. None of those whatsoever. What I found out is actually there's relatively strong social support and reach out from the neighbors. Next slide, please. This is my last slide. Uh, what we found out is there's only two ways by which this pandemic will end. One is that there's a vaccine or there's herd immunity. So we're taking a long view. This will be 2 or 3 years more. And we're setting in place a pandemic preparedness that is front and center people like me who are older adults. No? There's the perspective also that these cultural activities should go and proceed even in the neighborhood clusters. I think this is important to counter the fake news and do the news alert. Uh, we're starting to do this week. We started some mechanism. There was a festival, but it was so low profile and low key, involving clusters of neighborhood. And all of this, I should say, the good part is that the local government is aware that the older adults are the ones that have been compromised. So there's a choice. You will die of COVID or you will die of being isolated. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great presentation, and it certainly, raises the issue ultimately of costs and benefits. So far, the lockdown approaches have been put in place, and the entire metric are these models to flatten the curve and prevent deaths. But I completely agree. As we continue to isolate older people, we're going to see increased mortality there. Peter, I think our folks are now, of course, all participants are encouraged to use the Q&A function to send their questions in. But we have a couple, so go to your keyboards for sure, because we do have some time. Luke, I think you're going to share questions with us, is that right?
Hi, Carl. If you like, you can do it if you have access to the
I do.
Q&A and chat.
There we go. Of course, you're going to see me putting my head very close to the screen because of my nearsightedness. But so here's a question for the panel, and I guess just however you want to go, is the being allowed to go back to work may entail being coerced to do so by employers. So should older people have particular protections from that pressure due to their higher risk of death? And I will say that if you go into the stores that are still open in the US, our endless Walmarts and other things, many of the people are clearly individuals who are 60 and over, who I think do feel a certain amount of social pressure to go to work despite risk. So, was that question comprehensible? That is, well, what about, the flip side of rather than being prevented from social participation, like working, oops. Sorry, that was my timer for Joseph. Like what if people feel obligated to place themselves at risk? Does that question make sense to anyone?
This is Bethany. I'm going to have to leave in a few minutes, but I do have some initial thoughts about that. And particularly when we're talking about older people in low and middle income countries, most of the labor that they'll be participating in will be informal. And so those sorts of, that sort of demand might not be coming through in the same kind of way. I think that more than potential, more than an employer forcing someone back to work, there would be hunger and poverty forcing people to go back to work. And the answer, when we think from a disability rights perspective, which could be analogous here, is that where older people are engaged in employment, they should be entitled to reasonable accommodations. So maybe I'm just thinking out loud here. If an older person is going back to work, wants to be there, they should have full access to the personal protective equipment that they need, and possible changes in where they sit or how they interact with others that'll help them to be able to do their job and contribute and make money safely. And I'm going to have to run now, so I'll just say.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Sorry to lose you. Others want to chime in?
Can I say something?
Please.
I think there will be a discrimination. Most employers will just say, let's not hire those that are most vulnerable. Let's hire those who are able to get over the virus. That's my initial thought.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I think that's an excellent point. And I think that there's certainly, as we think about coming out of lockdown, the types of measures that should be put in place should be ones that protect everybody from risk. And so there will be people of all ages who are worried about going back to work. And so I think that whilst on the one hand, yes, we have to look at particular measures perhaps around older people and recognize the heightened risk they're at, that good public health responses are going to be ones that protect everyone, and that no one should feel coerced to go back to work under circumstances where they don't feel safe.
Other thoughts? Alrighty. Here's sort of a bigger.
Oh, sorry, Cole. Sorry to interrupt. I
Sure,
see
Peter.
some of the participants are raising their hands, and I don't know if that's specifically to ask a new question, in which case we'll kind of take each question in turn, or whether it's to respond to the question that's just been set. So,
Peter, you also are not inviting participants, am I right, to come on and talk? You would like them to use the Q&A or the chat function to ask their questions. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't know, Lucas, if there are people who are raising their hands, if you can.
Oh, here we
unmute their
go.
microphones.
I'm sorry. There were other ones which came in. I'm going to, I think they're noting that their questions are in. So here's another one, which is, what are the speaker's views on the difficult question of triage in the clinical setting in countries where health resources are scarce and the numbers of older people are large? So it's coming back. Does anyone have anything more to add around, the question of triaging in clinical settings as part of, this overall question?
I could come in on that. I think what's been really interesting is the way that this pandemic has brought this difficult question to the fore. I mean, I think that it's not a new one, this idea that you have to make very difficult choices in the face of scarce medical resources, and it throws up a range of difficult ethical questions. What has been interesting, though, I think, is the way that the spotlight has been put on the use of age in these decision-making processes, which perhaps it hasn't been, certainly for the general public, we haven't been exposed to this debate around the use of age to decide who gets medical treatment and who doesn't before. I've had a look at a number of protocols that have been developed from a whole range of different types of bodies. And what is interesting to me is that there seems to be this growing consensus that age should not be used as the sole or the main or the primary criteria on which these decisions are made. But still within some of them, age is still being allowed to be used, if you will, as in combination with other factors or as a secondary tier decider. So there seems to be a growing consensus that age should not be the only basis, but that it could be used in combination. And I still think we need to challenge this idea of using age in combination with other factors. And because what I think if we substituted age for a different non-medical characteristic, such as race or disability, it would be completely unacceptable to use these non-medical characteristics or gender, for example, to make a decision like this. And yet it's still seen as acceptable to use age. And there's a lot of commentary out there on how age is a poor proxy, is a very poor proxy for assessing someone's clinical situation. And so I think we still need to challenge this use of age, even in combination with other factors.
Excellent, thanks. That's a great response. Anyone else have a comment they would like to add?
Yeah, yes, just a short comment. That was the situation in Buenos Aires with this norm from the city government of Buenos Aires. The problem was not the possibility to do the work, just the people rise up their claims for the vulneration, the dignity that was through this measure from the government. That was the point, because we don't forget that Argentina has a wide coverage in terms of social protection. Almost 9 from 10 of our older people is receiving pensions. So the problem here was the dignity, the rights that were passed through the government with this point. Was a very, very huge toll from the political point of view for the government. Just that. Thank you.
Joseph, did you want to add at all?
No, I'm more on the non-medical interventions.
Gotcha.
There's
Well,
facility here is not one.
Well, there are ones on that as well. But let me just add one follow up from Alex in Brazil, who points out that from his perspective, the result of no lockdown at this stage is the collapse of the health system, but with catastrophic consequences for the whole population, a possible prolonged economic a recession, as we're seeing in Brazil with the number of cases and I presume deaths, doubling every few days. So that seems to raise this. Well, it's a question that we're not going to be able to resolve in the next half hour, but the balance of no lockdown at all leading to extraordinary community spread in countries like Brazil, and balancing those two, the safety versus sort of freedom aspect of it. It's a big question, but I don't know if folks want to opine. I'm not sure that the panelists are saying, even if we're concerned about the human rights issue, that no personal or social distancing is correct either necessarily. Is that right, Bridget? It looked like you might want to step in there.
I said that is a way too big a question for me to answer, but I think I would just would think about the types of measures. I mean, within a lockdown. I mean, obviously, the balance has to be made, but there are the question, are there measures that can be introduced that don't discriminate against certain people, or that don't have overbearing restrictions on their rights? Are there ways that you can do it differently, where you still protect people from risk of infection, and you try to avoid the collapse of the health services, but at the same time that you're not discriminating and you're not denying people's rights or their dignity, as Diego said. So I think it's the kind of measures that you're introducing.
Can I say something?
Yes, of course.
This is really a very big question right now. Our hypothesis is that you need to end this situation. So there's only, for us at the moment, we don't have a vaccine. So you have to wait for 2 to 3 years, perhaps longer. So what are you going to do? You're not going to be here on lockdown forever, all right? So what are the things that we can do as a community to regenerate economics, to have more cultural interaction, to have that social capital back in place? That's what we're trying to look at. We know that there's a lot of unknown on the behavior of the virus. If we are going to lift a lockdown and we don't do all of the physical distancing, it's a lot of risk. But like, for example, there's a question on how come we have a very few infection. In my village, in my town, 1 infection for every 12,000 people. Okay, so is it the weather? Is it this virus? Does it like to have like the hot and humid weather? It's 110 degrees now here, and it's humid. It's 55 to 60 degrees of humidity. Is this a factor? How long are we going to have like this? It's going to be rainy season in 3 weeks, so we're going to have dengue. So we will have dengue, and then we will have flooding, and then we will have COVID. So it's this is not normal. So we're trying to balance out every day. We're trying to learn something new on what we can do and what we cannot do. Are we going to do a lockdown? We cannot. It's not feasible to have a lockdown forever.
Diego, did you want to weigh in on that at all, or?
Well, actually, you are not alone, Joseph. We are in Buenos Aires with a dengue epidemic at the Buenos Aires city specifically. Where winter is coming for us. So, and the problem is that people is receiving very, in my personal point of view, irresponsible messages from the policy makers in terms of the quarantine should be finished without any kind of determined policy in terms of de-escalating, as Spain, for example. So we are expecting, in my personal point of view, I am very worried about the next weeks, because on the other hand, we must to remember that our health system and services are very weak. There is a very lack of resources in terms of massive testing, in terms of our system is very fragmented, in terms of providers are also segmented in terms of social economic status. So personally, I'm very worried in terms of the next weeks for Argentina and also for South Cone.
We have a question for Joseph, but I also think it might relate to what the rest of you have been speaking of. And Peter, you'll tell me when we need to stop. I think we have until 10:30, I think. But so this questioner writes, I read something recently about Bulacan province and unofficial curfews being placed on older people and village security forces being put in place. I'm not sure if you know about this, but if so, how might this increase the stigmatization of older people in communities? And I will add that although I don't know how targeted it is to older people, we're having a lot of this informal social sanctioning of people here who seem to be violating orders. But so Joseph, maybe if you can comment on that, of what it's like there, and this notion of, you know, unofficial curfews on older people and local security forces enforcing those.
Well, the initial report that came out from WHO and China, the fatality rate for older people are really very high. So the provincial government was aware of that. And there was, I was in a presentation on March 12th that there's a federation of senior citizens or older people in the province. And the decision was to shelter in place. Okay, so then came the lockdowns 1 to 2 days later, and the only organization that is robust in the Philippines at the village level are disaster responses. So these are the security personnel, and they don't have no one in this world, I think, understand what this COVID is all about. Even the public health in a middle income country, so it was a question of, is it a security problem or is it a public health problem or is it both? And who will tell? We don't know. So it's best at the moment, because we're hearing this Italy and this USA about this doubling of the curves and flattening of the curves and all that. Okay, so what the government did was do the disaster response, and these are the security personnel, and protect everybody else. Okay, so that's well and good for us. Okay, because the fatality rate here in my province is for older people are very low. Okay, so it's well and good for us, but I mean, you cannot have that law forever. You can do that for a few weeks. I mean, every week there is a relief good that's coming out of the local government. So the fiscal resources are already stretched. You cannot do this. So these people have to work. So security now, unofficial curfew, because you know that the virus is exponentially growing. Okay, but it didn't happen. There was no community transmission. So it didn't happen. So now we're in 55 days on lockdown, and we know that the curve is flattened. There's no community transmission. But why are we still not being allowed to go out? There is lifting of the lockdown on making except older
got
people
themselves into this and don't quite know how to get out of it. I think. Did either of the rest of you either of you would like to comment on this issue? Before.
Sorry, Cole. Can I just add a note? It's Peter here.
Yes, Peter, I was going to say, jump in.
No, it's that Joseph's actually written a really good blog about this, which is on our website. So please go and check out our blog. So we have a number of other blogs that refer to lockdowns in other countries as well, including in India, Indonesia, and Diego's written about Argentina as well. So if you want more information, it is on our website, what we have.
Well, maybe that's a good segue. I would like to ask the panel, if I could. I think I don't see any more questions that we have. Okay, actually, I'm sorry. We do have a new question, and this looks like maybe a good one for us to close on. But this is to all panelists, which is as and when we come out of lockdowns in different countries, how do we support older people to feel safe and have access to the kind of information they need to make their own decisions about leaving the house? And that's actually was going to be my closing question for you. We do have a situation, even in a very well-developed country like this, where absent a vaccine, there are some older people who are probably going to have to self-sequester. So an 80-year-old with multiple chronic conditions, especially if they're hypertension, diabetes, and others, may have to develop a plan for very limited social contacts for 12 to 18 months, and will need a whole range of interventions to make that socially and psychologically, acceptable. Those kinds of decisions are going to be way more difficult, I think, in low and middle resource countries. But what do we do as these lockdowns end to protect the most vulnerable people? And both in institutional and non-institutional settings. So I appreciate that question, and it's one that was on my mind. Who would like to tackle that one first? So what happens next to protect older people as lockdowns diminish?
Maybe.
Go ahead.
Bridget, go ahead.
I was thinking about it in terms of maybe some principles that need to be applied. Certainly, I think access to information, I mean, it's a right within itself, and it's one that is clear, older people are clearly not enjoying from the people that we have spoken to. A lot of them talk about being confused, they don't have access to information, or the information they're getting is very frightening. They don't know whether it's valid or not. So I think one of the principles that must be applied is that of transparency. I mean, there has to be transparency around the types of measures that are being introduced, either by the government or at a more local level, with the community level, and why. We need to know why a measure is being implemented. And I think the other principle is that there needs to be consultation with older people themselves, and that these decisions that are being taken, the public has to, for them to be effective, the public has to consent, and that includes older people as well. So there's something there around consultation and participation with older people and the rest of the community, so that we can understand why, as you say, we were able to make informed decisions about what we should be doing, to understand the risks, to be able to exercise our own judgment, and also that these measures will be much more effective if people buy into them, if they're sort of developed with consent. And if this is going to happen over a very long period of time, then so these issues of transparency, consultation, and participation are absolutely critical, I think.
Thanks. Joseph, did you want to?
Yes. Start with the information. That's the one that's important, because there's no non-medical public health advisories on what can be done, since this is about, let's say, herd immunity. What does that mean? And then you say it's about community protection. What's that mean? And give us something that we can do while we wait for a vaccine, something like that. So like daily sunshine, simple things that, and these are not there's no protocol. There's no guidance as to how do you build herd immunity? How do you do immunization from this virulent? Those are the things that we're doing right now. It's information. That's the one that will help. They know, because these are adults, they know how to be responsible.
Yeah. Thanks. Speaking of sunshine, I'm looking at your background, and we're expecting 3 inches of snow. So I'm kind of envious about that. Diego, do you have a thought on that?
Yes, I think that is really challenging to do a generic recommendation about this, but I would like to point it out 2 points that was raised up by Brigitte and Joseph too. I think that the first thing is the information. We need to be very transparent, very reliable in terms of information. We must remember that at the beginning of this pandemic, it was a kind of irresponsible communication from many sectors that built up a fear culture, mainly into the older people. That was really terrible in that terms. The other one was, I think that from an intersectoral approach, we must improve the participation of older people in the decision-making process. We need to respect his rights, his dignity, their rights mainly, in terms that, as they mentioned before, age is a not reliable proxy in terms of social participation, functionality, and other things. Thank you, Carl.
I think it's a great way to stop. I think what everybody agrees on, and we agree here too, the voice of older people has really been absent from this across the board. Peter, I would like, do you want to say some your sort of closing thoughts, having been heavily involved in this?
Well, I mean, Carl, I'm happy for you to try and wrap around some general comments. I'm going to say some things about our forthcoming events, but I struggle to reconcile, I think, ethics and rights here don't entirely seem to overlap in a way that I can manage. There seems to be, on one hand, a utilitarian ethical principle that some people would apply, but that utilitarian ethical principle, to some degree, does not entirely overlap with a fundamental rights-based perspective on these issues. So does it matter how many lives of older people may be specifically saved by either a lockdown, which is applied generally across the population in different ways for different periods of times, or recognizing that as much as we may dislike this fact, very old people have particular risk of dying of this condition, that there may be some proportionate approach which differentiates between different groups of people according to the different costs and benefits to them and to society more broadly as a consequence of those interventions. And you know, of course, on one hand, academics can sit around and we can have wonderful philosophical discussions about this. But of course, this is a dilemma which is incredibly acute and is playing out before our eyes. So I don't know if you, Carl, or any of the other speakers just very briefly can help me out here, because I don't know the answer to that massive question. Your mic's off, Carl.
I would add one thing to it, and I wonder if part of the explanation for the lack of impact on older people, we're discovering in the US, and I think now in European countries, that this is heavily a disease of what I would call trapped populations. So that, you know, for us, so we're discovering in the United States, and this is what a lot of us are working on, that in many of our states, 1/2 to 3/4 of all deaths, not just of older people, occur in long-term care facilities. So elder care facilities are vastly the preponderance of deaths. And now we're seeing in other sort of trapped populations, like in prisons and group homes, et cetera. So the community toll is much lower, except among, for example, homebound older people living in multi-generational households, or who require staff. So we're seeing that kind of a differentiation, which I think makes all of your points, that age itself, I mean, like one thing I'm getting from this conversation, that an undifferentiated lockdown criterion based on age is draconian and heavy-handed and needs to be more nuanced. Like, so that's one piece I've heard. So the need to differentiate among older people, the need to get older people's voices engaged here is another one. And I mean, we're hearing a problem that we can't deal with here and from comments, but the overall state of the health and long-term care systems in different countries are greatly having an impact on this. What, before we close, so what from our panel have we, have I missed there? Or do each of you have a closing thing you might like to share before Peter does housekeeping again? Anyone? Bridget, it looked like you were.
Can I just? I'm working on one more assumption here, based on the data that I saw 2 days ago, where it's saying that in the Philippines, around 90% of the cases are mild. So if I can put up a, let's say, a proposal to the local government that, okay, we will do herd immunization. Our objective is mild infection. Because the first picture that came out of this COVID are, overwhelmed hospitals with intubations and ventilators, which is scary. But when we look at the data, 90% is mild. So
yeah, that's of course, true around the world. That's
yes,
true.
but 70% of fatality in the Philippines are older people. So there's a balance. I mean, I'm trying to justify how do we lift this lockdown for older people at the same time there's no fatality, knowing that there's only mild infection. So what is immunization? What is immunity, natural immunity for getting a mild infection? So is that a public health issue or is that a governance issue? I don't know. But the common good would be actually, you know, let's all try to change everything at the same time, you know, get this virus out of the way by changing what we eat, how we relate to each other. That's my last thought.
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess maybe, did you want to add one thing, Bridget? Or because I think we are reaching the end of our time. So if you have a quick one, that would be great.
Very quickly, my sort of parting thought was, you know, quite rightly we've been focusing on lockdown measures here. We've been talking about the impacts of the virus, but for me, one of the key things is the way that the pandemic has exposed the existing inequalities and marginalization that older people face and is exacerbating that. And I think that cuts across a whole number of different human rights issues. And so a takeaway for me is we need to put it in that context. And as we move into recovery phases and go out of lockdown, we have to address these existing underlying inequalities. And if we don't, then things will not change.
Absolutely. Diego, did you want to add anything at the end?
Yes, I am in harmony mainly with some words from Joseph. A pandemic is at the beginning an infectologic health problem, but nowadays we are in a social crisis. They put focus, they put light in older people mainly for the human rights, but we need to see the situation with perspective. It's not really good to put on hands, on infectology hands, and on health hands. We need to a comprehensive and integral approach of this situation, because nowadays we are dealing between the sickness from the health perspective and also for the consequences from the economic approach. So we need to get a balance, at least at the vaccine appear at the landscape.
Absolutely. All right, well, thank you all. This has been an extraordinary panel. Really, really fascinating topics and wonderful analyses. And Peter, thanks for engaging me, and I'm going to push things back over to you. Thanks everyone again.
Well, thank you so much, Carl, and to all the speakers and the participants. Again, I've really learned a lot and I've really enjoyed this session. I just want to look ahead to next Friday, where we will be looking at, to some extent, a rather different topic. We'll be looking at pensions, social protection, and older people in the context of coronavirus. We have speakers from the International Labour Organization, again from HelpAge International, and we have academics speaking from Peru and from South Africa. Something else that we're going to try and do for the following Fridays, since this is meant to be a network and a platform, we're encouraging people to develop their own proposals for thematized webinars. This should now be going up on our website, this link. It's a bit like making a proposal for a panel at a conference. So you'll see you're asked to provide a topic and suggest 2 or 3 speakers who would speak to that topic. So there are so many things we could talk about that we haven't had a chance to talk about in these weekly webinars. As long as it's got something to do with coronavirus, older people, and low and middle income countries, you know, we'd really like to hear from you. And moving forward, the idea is that you can do this anytime on a Friday at 2 o'clock UK time. That's become our fixed time. If we don't get proposals, we will probably still run our own webinars, possibly on a fortnightly basis as opposed to on a weekly basis, but we'll just see how that goes. Next slide, please. One final point as well. In I think it was our second webinar, we focused on ageism, and there was a call for further action during that and following that webinar. I'm not sure if we'd describe it as a group, but certainly some kind of focus on how ageism plays out in the context of coronavirus. We've got a dedicated section on our website about some of those ongoing activities. And we had a Zoom, 2 Zoom sessions about this on Monday this week, which were very interesting. And some information coming out of those Zoom sessions will be, should already have come out, but Carl and I have been far too busy, but that will be coming out at some point, I think, over the weekend. So watch this space. We will circulate that to people who are already in our mailing list who are interested in this topic, and we will also present it on the website. Final slide, please. Well, again, this is a massive thanks, particularly to Lucas Sempe, who has basically done all the logistical behind the scenes work for organizing this webinar, and all the many other people who are involved as volunteers, doing all kinds of things to keep this global platform going. If you want to get involved, if you want to help, oh, by the way, it doesn't include Carl and a number of his colleagues now who've also been giving their time for free. Please let me know, because we're trying to do as much as we can with very few human resources and almost no funding. So thank you so much. I hope to get to see you sometime next week, and I will let Carl have the final and dubious honor to sign off and to say, to bid adieu to our wonderful public.
Yeah, you know, go forth and prosper, as we say on Star Trek. No, this has really been, and Peter, I just thanks to you and to all the folks working with you for this tremendous effort. You know, I mean, those of us in places like the US have a great tendency to forget what's going on in the rest of the world and how this has an effect on human rights and human well-being. So this kind of forum is extraordinary, and I certainly look forward to being a part of it. And again, thanks to everybody, and thanks to everyone who joined us. You're muted, Peter.
Goodbye, everybody. Stay safe, stay well, and stay in touch. Bye.
Exactly. Okay, bye-bye.